To discuss outpacing the CCP, please welcome Representative John Moolenaar, Chairman of the House Select Committee on China, and Michelle Giuda, CEO of the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy.
Hear me okay? Am I on? All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. Chairman Moolenaar, thank you so much for this conversation. And I want to start out by saying thank you, because the work that you have done on the China Select Committee in partnership with Representative Krishnamurthy has been extraordinary in bringing a lot of urgency and bipartisan clarity to one of the key issues of our time. So thank you for your leadership.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's good to be with you and with everybody today.
And I want to start out before we dive in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge. So today is the 35th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. And we have with us here Dr. Jianli Yang, who was there in 1989 as a survivor of the Tiananmen massacre. Dr. Yang has served 5 years in prison in China. He's done a lot of extraordinary work to advance democracy in China and around the world. And so thank you for being here. We're honored by your presence and your courage. Thank you. All right, so Chairman Moolenaar, I'm going to start us out with a little bit of a twist, and I think you're going to like it. But if you look at the name of our panel here, it's called Outpacing the CCP. And there's something about that doesn't feel quite right. And I'm going to propose that it's not America's job to outpace the Chinese Communist Party. But in fact, it's America's job to lead so decisively that the CCP is scrambling to try to outpace us. And this concept of China as our pacing challenge and our pacing threat has really taken hold in DC, in the defense community, in the policy planning community. And I think it's very dangerous to export our ambition to an adversary. And the work that the Select Committee has done has been so extraordinary in shining a light on this threat. But you and I both know that it doesn't stop there, right? And we have to have a proactive policy in order for the United States to lead. So let me start with that so that we're framing our conversation off right. And based on all that you see, how do we flip this mindset so that the United States is focused on leading and the CCP is trying to outpace us?
Sure. Well, let's face it, the world is better off when America leads. And it's going to be important to continue that. You know, we are set up as a select committee to win this strategic competition. And whether it's technology, whether it's the military, whether it's human rights, economic, the world is better off when we lead. And no greater example than people who spoke out for freedom. The CCP didn't respond with dialogue, they responded with tanks. And we never want to submit our future to the Chinese Communist Party and their way of surveillance and domination.
And so if we talk about defining versus reacting to an adversary like that, that's exactly what you're doing today in unveiling the America First AI policy, which we're announcing here today. This is just out, and you're making the case that artificial intelligence is a defining strategic asset for the United States. Talk to us a little bit about the America First AI policy and how it's helping us lead, not react.
Well, first I want to compliment the innovators in America who have developed such a leading edge in technology. I think it's fantastic when you look at semiconductors, when you look at the innovation that's occurring in AI. But we have to realize AI is more than just sort of a new technology. It's going to be a defining technology for military, for defense, for all sorts of areas. In the wrong hands, that will lead to further surveillance, further oppression, and further threats to the world order. And so it's important that America leads and dominates in this field. And so the America First AI policy would ensure that America continues the leadership in that role. And what it looks like is, the Trump administration has already been reaching out and making deals with different countries. The president's been to UAE, Saudi Arabia. And the key thing there is they want to have U.S. technology. They want to do data centers. But it's important to have guardrails when it comes to this technology. And they were very clever to say, okay, we want to have you participate in this, but we also want you to invest in America. And there are other countries who can't do that, but they can also help with rare earth materials, mining, processing. So I would call this sort of a digital diplomacy, if you will, finding like-minded countries who want to participate with American ingenuity and innovation, but do it in a responsible way where there's guardrails, where it doesn't fall into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, who would use it for nefarious purposes.
So let's talk about that tension and that push and pull a little bit. Because you talk about some of these new deals, like in the Middle East, where we're providing some advanced semiconductors to some partners there. And it's interesting because export controls used to be a very niche issue. And now it feels like it's front page news almost every single day, and especially when it comes to semiconductors. And at the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy, we like to say that loose chips sink ships, similar to World War II.
That's very good.
Because semiconductors and chips aren't just about technology and about commerce. It's about driving and powering our military and all of our levers of power. So in addition to this AI, America First AI policy, you've also helped introduce the CHIPS Security Act, which would make sure that we are tracking and preventing the smuggling of these chips to our adversaries, and namely China, including location verification for advanced chips, which I think is so interesting. So talk a little bit about this push and pull, because we have this dual mandate on the one end to proliferate as much American technology as possible, so the world is consolidating around the American technology stack. And at the same time, we have to ensure maximum protection of those things. How do we proliferate and protect at the same time?
No, I think that's key. We want to have our platforms, our technology to be the backbone of this revolution, if you will. But at the same time, we want to limit access to that so we always stay ahead. And that requires partnerships with reliable partners. And it requires us to have a system where, you know, when we're supplying those partners, you know, the technology that we supply them is not getting into the wrong hands. And one way to do that is to make sure that there are ways to track where that technology ends up, where those chips end up. And so the legislation we've been working on would have sort of geolocation capabilities, so that if you sell chips to a company in Singapore, it's not just a PO box that ends up going to China, but rather you know exactly where those chips end up, and it requires, you know, a government policy, but also businesses to be accountable for where their technology is ending up, because we want them to advance their sales and technology, but at the same time, we don't want to enrich our adversaries to help them with their military-industrial complex.
So you had talked about, and you've mentioned a number of times, the importance of cooperation with our partners and allies. And so just a few days ago, you brought a number of democracies together through your role as chairing for the United States IPAC, which is the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, to deepen coordination against China economically, from an infrastructure perspective and technology. And we know that type of coalition building is really critical to our success. We're doing it at the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue, and we call it the Global Trusted Tech Network. And what we're doing is building on our legacy in the Clean Network to secure 5G. We brought 60 countries and 200 telecommunications companies together to only use trusted vendors and ultimately remove high-risk players like Huawei when it came to 5G. And that effort's really a nice blueprint for how we cooperate with our allies. But now we're seeing it again, and it's like we're watching the sequel of Huawei returns with their newest product called Harmony OS. And it sounds nice, Harmony OS, not so harmonious though. But can you talk to us a little, what is Harmony OS? Why is it a challenge? Because you issued a warning on this, the committee did recently. And then what's the opportunity right now for allies to align on this early before it takes a foothold, like with 5G?
Sure. Well, it's an operating system, and that's about the extent of my understanding of technology when it comes to this. But here's the bottom line. Huawei is affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party. And when you think of the rules that they live under, the 2017 National Security Law requires Chinese nationals, Chinese companies to basically submit to whatever the Chinese Communist Party requires. So that means supplying data, supplying information, allowing them to continue surveillance, all these areas, civil military fusion, and to have an entity that is affiliated with Huawei on American phones or even allied phones simply would put us in a position where we're vulnerable to the CCP. And as you point out, Harmony sounds like a very friendly thing, but you have to remember that behind that is the Chinese national security law and agenda, which oppresses people, surveils people, transnationally represses people, and has been a major malign influence when it comes to American opportunities. You think of Volt Typhoon, hacking into our infrastructure. When you think of Salt Typhoon monitoring the highest levels of our government communications, we don't want to expand that writ large, and that's something that Harmony would enable them to do.
So you're talking about these technologies like Harmony OS, DeepSeek, Huawei. The interesting thing about these technologies is that they're not just defense tech and used for military purposes, but in so many cases they're on our personal iPhones, and it's consumer technologies. So as you're traveling back to Michigan and traveling across the United States, we saw each other recently in Austin, Texas. As you're traveling across the United States, what are you hearing and seeing when it comes to the American public and their awareness of the threat on China? Because the committee's been doing so much to raise the level of awareness, to shine a light on these things. Is it having traction across the American public?
I believe it's happening, but Americans want to believe the best. And I think 30 years ago we were thinking China was going to become this country very much like America, with a middle class that would buy products, they'd be responsible players in the world order. They talked about a peaceful rise of China. What we've seen under Xi Jinping is just the opposite of that. And so I think Americans are waking up to the idea that maybe what we had hoped for did not happen. And now we have a country that is threatening its neighbors, their sovereignty in the South China Sea, threatening war over Taiwan. Just in my home state of Michigan, within the last couple of years, we've had Chinese national students spying at Camp Grayling. We had a Chinese national voting in elections illegally, and then they go back to China. We just yesterday learned about a situation where a Chinese professor, a researcher, was bringing in a plant-based material that could be used as agro-terrorism. And you say, well, this is not the Chinese people. We aren't putting a broad brush, but what we are saying is the Chinese Communist Party will leverage any Chinese national for their purposes, and often those purposes are counter to American interests. So we're helping people understand that. We love the Chinese people, but we do not want to have an expanded role for the Chinese Communist Party here or with our allies, and like-minded countries need to band together to prevent that.
So let's talk about that a little bit when it comes to educating the American public and education more broadly. And your committee has been quite vocal in looking at higher ed as a critical resource in this competition against the CCP. And none of the global alignment that we've talked about really matters unless we're competitive here at home. And one of the clearest and most urgent gaps that we face in the United States is tech talent. And at Purdue University, we actually just wrapped the longest commencement in America a couple of weekends ago. I think it was 20 hours collectively.
Wow.
And part of that has to do with scale, because Purdue's going to graduate more engineers than any other top university in the country. Meng Cheng calls it excellence at scale. But the gap nationally remains really stark. And if you look at some of the numbers from the National Science Foundation, China in 2020 graduated 2 million from first degree science and engineering degrees. The United States was less than half of that at 900,000. And if you look at some advanced degrees, when it comes to doctorates in science and engineering, China recently surpassed us. They issued 43,000, we're at 42,000. And so we have a lot to do in terms of getting to scale. with our STEM education. So from your leadership role in Congress and all that you're doing on the committee, where do you see a big opportunity to initiate a movement toward STEM education so that we're doing two things? One, really inventing and innovating the future, but secondly, it's a chance for STEM students to serve their country in this competition.
Well, that is a great question. It's something I think a lot about where, if you think of the space race and what helped galvanize America's leadership in that area, it was Sputnik. And there was a Sputnik moment where we realized we cannot fall behind the Soviet Union in technology. And it encouraged President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy after him to really take initiative in this area. And I believe we don't have a Sputnik moment, but we sure have had a lot of different moments that should be creating an awareness. And it's our job to communicate with the next generation. And I think AI, when you look at robotics and the young people involved in robotics in high school, when you look at some of these areas, the more we can make math and science fun and unleash the creative instincts of our young people, we will win. But I think we've lost that a little bit, but we need to regain it.
And it's so interesting to see STEM become a core part of our national security. And one of the things that we're doing at the Krach Institute is we launched about a year ago the Tech Diplomacy Academy. I was just telling you a little bit about this backstage. And our goal is to help upskill not just up-and-coming students, but the U.S. government and allied governments when it comes to technology. Because if you're a foreign service officer these days and you're trying to implement policy on 5G or on AI, you have to have a fundamental vocabulary around all of these emerging technologies. And there's 22 that the White House has identified as being critical to our national security. And so we're helping to upskill U.S. and allied governments. But from your perch in Congress, where do you see a gap or maybe an opportunity to upskill government leaders, whether it's in Congress, at the State Department, or allied governments? Because as you're having conversations around the world, it's difficult to try to shape policy without that fundamental vocabulary.
Yeah, well, and technology moves so quickly. And while you were talking, I was reminded of my background. I grew up in a community where there was a chemical company. And so, one neighbor's a chemical engineer, another one's a chemist, different. And that exposed me to how science education can relate to a job. And I think as a country, we need to help young people, we need to help government officials understand the relevance of science in making public policy and what career options there are, and how, when it comes to our defense, you think of what helped us win the Cold War. Yeah. It was economic growth, it was technological leadership, also in the defense space, and that's kind of a formula for victory when it comes to this in the future.
Now, you're just back from, you said you were in Singapore, in Shangri-La, and a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific. So as you're out there talking about the United States and our competitive edge, it's really about the U.S. and the free world having a competitive edge. I would love to hear a little bit about your conversations in Singapore, Vietnam, and some of these other countries where you, I think, literally just flew back from.
Just got back, yeah. Well, first of all, when we were in Singapore, it was for the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is a lot of defense leaders from around the world. And our Secretary, Pete Hegseth, did an excellent job outlining American foreign policy and defense policy in the Indo-Pacific, and I was very pleased to see that. We had meetings with some of the leaders in the Philippines, the defense secretary in the Philippines, and what was very interesting was we heard firsthand how China is trying to dominate the South China Sea and encroaching on territory that Philippines belongs to them. And is threatening them, and you read the stories of the fishermen, the different people with water cannons, and you see a very aggressive approach by the CCP, and they're doing it with Vietnam as well. And so when we were there, I was amazed when you consider 50 years ago, we were in a war with Vietnam, and now the approval rating for the United States and Vietnam exceeds 80%. And this is with a communist government. But they love America, they love our values, they love the idea in some way working with us, and our government has done a great job helping, with the people missing in action, with some of the different effects of the war, and trying to build those relationships. Philippines very much appreciates our efforts to make sure they can remain sovereign and independent. In Singapore, they hosted this amazing event, and they are a place where a lot of diplomacy is happening. So, the one message I heard over and over again is that they want to see American presence, they want to see American leadership, and they want to stay connected with America. Now, often they don't want to choose between America and China. And so we need to be respectful that, each country has their trade partnerships. But the more we can build those relationships, I think it benefits the entire free world.
I was in Vietnam about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, and had the same sort of sentiment, sky-high willingness and excitement about working with the United States. And I met with a number of different ministries, and it didn't matter which ministry I met with. They wanted to talk about semiconductors, the defense ministry, the foreign ministry, IT. And it's interesting because technology is such a cross-cutting issue, whether it comes to the United States competing with China or how we partner with our allies. And then here in the United States, it's also a great area for bipartisan consensus. And as you're traveling around the world, or even in the United States, how much are you hearing and seeing about, or I guess hearing about, the United States is evolving its relationship with so many allies across the world, but as I said, technology feels like a nice area of cooperation. Does that ring true when you're overseas?
It really does. I think it's a great opportunity for our private sector to grow their markets. And it's also an important responsibility that we have as leaders to make sure those technologies are used for good purposes. And our number one adversary in this regard is China. And when you look at their no limits partnership with Russia, when you look at the evolving partnership with Iran, North Korea, and other countries, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela, you realize that countries who don't want to be part of that network could be very valuable allies to the United States. And we have a lot where we could benefit from, critical minerals mining. You look at how China's leveraging the magnets to bring our auto industry to its knees. And we don't want to be dependent. We saw how during COVID they were completely unresponsive and not open to the origins, and then they were leveraging their control of PPE and other medicines based on their interest. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity for America to reach out actually through the private sector, not simply through government aid, but actually through our innovation and innovative partnerships.
And the bipartisan nature of this topic, of the United States leading and having China try to outpace us, is really interesting. And I feel like when you talk about technology, you talk about competing with China, for the most part, you can't tell who's red and who's blue, who's an R and who's a D. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your perspective on that, because the Select Committee is such a shining example of bipartisan consensus on calling things out. Like, where do you see more opportunities for that?
Sure. Well, we're always going to have different political viewpoints, but I would say the people involved in our Select Committee are involved because they want to get this policy right for the United States' future. And we realize this is such a key area, whether it's human rights, whether it's national security, whether it's economic security. We need to reset this relationship with China and put it on a good trajectory so that we have a sustainable leadership in the future. So the contrast between many committees in Congress, where it's one side trying to, upstage the other side, the questions we're asking in committee are trying to get answers to lead to solutions. And that, to me, has been probably the most rewarding thing I've been part of in Congress. We've done a number of investigations. We were the ones who investigated the Chinese CCP connection to the fentanyl crisis that's killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. And we actually discovered that it wasn't just China turning a blind eye. It wasn't organized crime out of control. It was actually the CCP's tax policy, where they were subsidizing, giving a tax rebate to chemical companies who would manufacture the precursors of fentanyl, couldn't sell them in China, but they could export them and get a tax rebate. So they were partnering with the drug cartels in Mexico, who then brought it across our southern border. So you can see that, you know, this is an area that all of America has a stake in, and we got to get it right.
Now, you've talked about the private sector and the role of the private sector a number of times. And so I think we have time for one more question, and this is my last question. It's a big one.
Okay.
Week after week, your committee is sending letters to American companies about supply chains, about certain investments, about partnerships in which they are tied to the CCP or to the People's Liberation Army, or both. And the message is really clear that American companies can't keep underwriting our adversaries, yet it's still happening, and we see it pretty often. And at the Krach Institute, we work with a lot of tech companies, we work with a lot of businesses to try to navigate these tensions. And we know that it's tricky, because quarterly earnings are the North Star, and the global marketplace is really competitive. But in the long run, a safe and a free and a prosperous America is really good for business. And so if we start thinking in the long term, we might make some different decisions. And as you have mentioned several times, if we're going to win this competition, it's going to be through innovation, and it's going to be through enterprise. And so in that case, business has to lead and not just follow. So for my final question, based on all that you're doing and seeing with the committee, what is the one message that you want every American CEO to understand when it comes to helping the United States protect our national security and our prosperity?
That's a great question. I would say this. It's not simply the job to sell more product and have a quarterly return that looks good, but there also is a responsibility to safeguard the system that actually allows the freedom to innovate and to have commerce in the first place. And unfortunately, for too long, we've had American businesses and even taxpayers have been unwittingly supporting the military-industrial complex of China, and in some cases supporting, and customers have been buying products that were made with slave labor. And so we've been trying to illustrate the problem when you have supply chains that are linked to forced labor. We've been trying to highlight when American businesses are investing and partnering with companies that are affiliated with the People's Liberation Army and their military-industrial complex, and universities who are educating and partnering with Chinese universities that are actually partnering with their Chinese military applications. And those innovations could be used against men and women in our military. And so I think it's creating an awareness, but then also accountability. But you're right, I think many are still under the expectation that China is going to become more democratic, more freedom-loving, a benign influence around the world, and that's just not reality, and we need CEOs to wake up to that fact.
All right, well, thank you for shining a light on that reality, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all you're doing to lead the Select Committee, to lead a bipartisan movement, a national movement, and really internationally as well on the threats that the CCP place. And we're confident that with that, we'll be able to lead and outpace the CCP. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it very much.